Hello, welcome. So I'm Shemika Lamare, and today I want to talk to you about self-care and how to avoid burnout. One second. Oh, here we go. So the way I structured my talk is I want to spend some time discussing my journey as a data scientist and how I almost burned out. And then after that, I want to go over self-care, the history, and how you can take time to make your own definition of self-care. And the last part will mainly focus on creating habits around self-care. And to end it, I will give you some tips that I currently use to manage my stress. So burnout is the physical or mental collapse caused by overwork or stress. For me, this really meant that I would be in a place where I didn't feel like I could continue studying, and so that's how I viewed burnout. So to understand my story, I have to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a biologist turned data enthusiast. I studied biology at the University of California, Berkeley, and from there, I've been on a non-traditional path into data science. I'm really passionate about the way that data can be used to improve our society. And so I had to make a decision about how I was going to learn data science. And after Berkeley, I realized that I did not want to go and get a master's, and also considering cost. So I figured if people are learning how to program, I can do that myself. So I decided to self-study. I currently work full-time, and so I decided I would just study in the evenings and on the weekends. So I spent a lot of time going to meetups and finding groups and communities around programming. That all worked out really well, and I gained a lot of skills in Python and data science, and I decided to enroll in a boot camp, a part-time boot camp, because I wanted to solidify those skills. And so the boot camp was 3 months, twice a week, 3 hours each, 3 hours for those 2 times a week. And I felt like that would be reasonable while working full-time. And so I enrolled in it earlier this year. About a month in, I realized that I was not sleeping as much, and my room was a mess, and I hadn't seen my friends really. I was really just working and studying, and I basically never wasn't at dance class, which is something that's important to me. And so that night I realized that I needed to take some time and evaluate what I was doing, and think about how I can incorporate self-care into that, because I really felt like I was on the verge of burnout. And so I still had 2 more months of the course, and what I really needed to do was take time to think about time management and how I could ensure that I was making time to, having 7 hours of sleep, making sure my room was clean, because that was just a pet peeve of mine. Making time to see my friends, because social interactions are important, and doing something that I really love, which is dance, and that helps me take my mind off other things. So I got through the course, thankfully, and I didn't burn out, but this really reminded me that I need to incorporate self-care. So when I was thinking about self-care and what that meant to me, I decided to look up a little bit of the history of what that term means. And it's actually was coined by Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So Audre Lorde was an activist and a big part of the civil rights movement. And so self-care actually was born from that movement and rooted in it. And it was a way for them to really to remind themselves that they needed to think about their bodies and their health and take care of themselves while they were trying to improve society. And so I think about that definition, I think of the way I view self-care now, and I think nowadays it's really viewed as something where someone does something for themselves, and the spectrum for self-care can vary, right? You can do something as simple as, cleaning up your room, or it could be something like going to get a massage, right? There's a spectrum for it, and you really have to find what self-care means for you. Each person is gonna be different. So these are some examples of things that could be self-care, and I think that for each person to find those is really important. So during my journey, when as an aspiring data scientist and almost reaching burnout, I really needed to look at what was important for me to maintain myself, self-care. And I kind of just, what I did is I made a list and I put it up near my mirror, and I, see that every day, and I make sure to incorporate it. So I encourage you all, if you feel comfortable, to tweet out something you do as self-care, or what you consider your definition of self-care. I'd really love to see what other people consider self-care to be for themselves, and I think it's also really inspiring to see how other people take care of themselves. Feel free to tag me or use the hashtag AnxietyTech so that I can find it. So in order to incorporate the self-care habits into my life, I decided to go back to this book that my therapist gave me when I was in college. It's called The Power of Habit. And so what it's about is they took a bunch of research on habit formations, and it really goes over examples from marketing techniques of how they've used it to convince consumers to, for instance, Febreze, use it in their house after they finished cleaning, right? That was a habit that they were able to create or convince people to go forth with that habit, right? So there's a lot of research on that, and I found they have some tips about how to use that for yourself. So I'm gonna go over a little bit of how to create habits. And I think this one quote is really important. The brain can't tell the difference between good and bad habits, and I think that's important because it just goes to show that you can change any of those habits. So the way that habits are created is this is the framework. So you have a cue, which is what triggers the brain to go into automatic mode. You have the routine, which is the physical, mental, or emotional, just the thing that you are doing. And the reward that's what determines whether or not your brain should memorize it. So this is kind of the loop of creating habits. And so we'll go over some examples. So for this one, if you start at the routine, you have someone who, in this example, was taking a break and going to the cafeteria to get cookies. And he, in this case, felt like he was gaining weight and was unsure of, and wanted to stop that habit. So what he did was he looked at what was causing him to go get those cookies. And so what he did was he made a list of what those potential items could be. So it could be anywhere from deciding that he was, was it because he was hungry? Was it because he was bored? Was it because he wanted to go and chat with someone? And so looking through that, you have to do some kind of self-discovery to look at what's causing that routine. And in this case, he found that it was because he wanted to go and chat with coworkers. So it wasn't that he really wanted a cookie because he wasn't actually hungry at that time. It was just that he wanted to have that temporary distraction, right? And so from that, you have to look at what's causing that. What's the cue for that? And what he did is he noticed that it was the time. So every day, at a certain time, he would start to realize that he needed a distraction, and so he would go get a cookie. So that's a little bit of how the habit framework is, how to create habits. And so the difficult part is really the cues and the rewards, is figuring out what those are. And so cues generally fit into these 5 categories: location, time, emotional state, other people, and immediately preceding action. So that can help break down the framework and help you decide what the cue is so that you can adjust your habit. Habits can be changed, but they can't be erased. And so in that sense, if you wanted to go about changing a habit, I'm going to go over an example. So in this case, what we have is someone whose routine is they have a drink, the reward is that they're happy, and the cue is that they drink when they're sad. So if they wanted to change this, they would look at the routine, right? So instead of when they got when they got sad, they instead go and talk to someone, whether they go talk to their therapist or they talk to their friends, whomever it may be, and they get that same satisfaction or reward at the end. So that's one way to change habits, but the thing about it is that it takes a lot of time and self-reflection to be able to figure out what the cue is and what the reward is for yourself. It's a personal experience. And so lastly, I want to spend some time talking about tips that I use in my day-to-day to ensure that I'm handling my stress. So I'm a really big advocate for people protecting their time and energy because it's finite. I really think that we only have so much time in a day, and we only have so much energy that we are able to put forth to any of our activities. And so we want to make sure that we're being strategic about how we're using them. And so that's one way that I ensure that I'm handling my stress. Another is saying no, because the only thing that matters is an enthusiastic yes. And I really love this because an example would be sometimes people, like let's say your friends want to hang out with you and they're like, hey, I want to go bowling. And you're kind of like, yeah, that's fine, I'll go. But notice how you felt about that. You weren't enthusiastic about it. So you probably didn't actually want to go. But let's say another friend came to you and was like, hey, I want to go to this concert. Do you want to go? And you're like, yes, I want to go. Like, I've actually been trying to go to that. I was going to contact you about it. You know, there's a difference in how excited you were about it. And so I've started doing is that if I don't want to do something, I don't do it, right? I don't do it to please them. So for instance, with the person with bowling, I would probably be like, hey, I don't actually want to go bowling. I'm down to hang out. Let's do something else. So really that also goes back to the time and energy, recognizing that it's finite and doing things that you really want to do. Setting boundaries, this is really important. I have to set boundaries between work and studying, and so I'm really good at setting boundaries for work. I don't work at home. That's just like my choice to not bring my work into my home because I feel like it'll create that habit of as soon as I walk into the door, I'll be like, oh, like let me just check my work email and like respond to that person. And unfortunately, I don't have the time for that, right? I need to focus on my studies. And so really setting boundaries, whether it's for work or personal life, I think it's really important because that goes back to protecting your time and energy. Next is, this has been a theme throughout today, was turn off notifications on apps. I really advise this if you're looking to de-stress. I turn off all notifications, and the only notification that I have is if someone calls me. So all the apps, there's no notifications, there's no pop-ups, and I really have found that it just keeps me off of them. And so I find that helpful. And then make time for me time. So this is really important because this is like, to me, a big part of self-care. I wouldn't have been able to recognize that I was almost burnt out if I hadn't taken me time and evaluated, hey, like something's not right. I'm not my usual self, right? I had to take that time for self-reflection. And then me time is also important if you want to be able to change some of those habits. Again, it takes some time to think about the process of creating habits, and so you really need to set aside that time. So me time can be, whether it's something like for me, looking at my habits and looking at my stress management, or it could be something that's self-care related, but really just taking time for yourself is important. And then this is a big lesson that I've learned this year, was that I won't be productive every day. I would love to believe that I'm going to create a schedule for 3 months and I'm going to hit every mark and complete all the projects I want to do, but I've learned that that's not realistic, and that there are going to be some days where I just don't want to study, right? And I need to save time for that so that I don't continue make to-do lists that I can't complete. So yes, that's. So overall, what I've talked about today was my experience in my journey with burnout and the importance of taking time to find what self-care means for you. And with that, recognizing the routines that you can do to replace those self-care, to replace those bad habits with self-care routines. And just coming here today, you're already taking time for yourself. That's really important, and you should be proud of yourself for being here. So go out, do all the self-care things. I'd love to see some of you tweet about it so I can see what other people view as self-care. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, definitely come find me, and thank you.